It was the summer of 2011, and I was 13 years old. Life back then was pretty simple. Social media hadn't completely taken over the world yet, and kids still spent most of their time outdoors. It was mid-July, just a few days after my birthday. I remember it clearly because my friends and I were eating leftover ice cream cake in the yard. My parents had left me home alone for the day, but they gave me permission to have a couple of friends over, my buddies Kyle and Zook, as long as we stayed on the property. We grew up in a quiet, classic suburban neighborhood in Westchester, New York. It was a bright, sunny afternoon, so instead of staying inside to play video games, we headed straight out to the backyard. Our house had a pretty distinct setup. Right off the back door was an awning covering a patio with outdoor furniture, with 2 steps leading down to a long grassy backyard that widened out toward the trees. It was the perfect spot for sports, wrestling, or just messing around. That afternoon we were play wrestling, mimicking WWE superstars and trying out all their signature moves on the grass. Right in the middle of our match, I happened to glance up at the second floor of the house. Even with the sun glaring off the glass, I saw someone standing right at my parents' bedroom window, staring straight down at us in the yard. Now remember, nobody was supposed to be home. I immediately froze, shouted "Time out!" and pointed up at the window. But the second I called it out, the figure stepped back into the shadows and vanished. Neither Kyle nor Zook caught a glimpse in time. I told them someone was upstairs, brushed off their confusion, and hurried toward the back door to check it out myself. I stepped inside and called out my older sister's name, then my mum's and dad's. Silence. The lower floor was completely dead quiet. I walked over to the stairwell leading up to the main level and called out again. Still no answer. But right then, I heard the faint, distinct creak of floorboards coming from directly upstairs. Someone was definitely up there. Thinking my parents might have come home early without us noticing, I ran to the landline phone in the den and called my mum's cell. No answer. I tried my dad's cell next. Nothing. I walked up to the main entrance near the front door to check the driveway through the front window. Neither of my parents' cars were there. The only person left it could possibly be was my sister, though it made no sense for her to be lurking around my parents' room. I stood near the bottom of the stairs leading to the upper bedrooms and shouted her name one more time. This time, the footsteps were louder and clearer, coming from just around the corner at the top of the stairs. I stared up into the hallway, and my stomach dropped. Protruding slightly from behind the wall was a bare foot, pointing directly down toward the staircase. It was a man's foot. Whoever was standing up there was actively hiding from me, listening. It was not anyone in my family. I forced myself not to panic out loud. I turned around and walked at a steady pace back toward the den, making sure not to look like I was running. But the moment I reached the den, I sprinted straight for the landline, grabbed it, and ran out the back door to my friends. Frantically, I kept redialing my mum's number while explaining to Kyle and Zook that an intruder was hiding upstairs. On the 4th try, my mum finally answered, sounding a bit annoyed by the repeated calls, but her tone shifted instantly when I stammered out that a stranger was in the house. She shouted, "Why are you calling me? Hang up right now and call 911. As I was hanging up, Zook suddenly grabbed my arm, pointed up and whispered, "Yo, look." This time it was my bedroom window. Standing behind the glass was the silhouette of a person peering down at us again. A second later, they backed away. That confirmed the nightmare. A complete stranger was inside my home, wandering from room to room. I dialed 911 immediately. Hands shaking, I gave the dispatcher our address and explained the situation. She told us to stay outside in the backyard and assured me a unit was already on the way. Being Westchester, the police response time was impressively fast. Within minutes, someone began banging loudly on our backyard gate. It was a police officer announcing himself. I yelled for him to come in and told him the intruder was somewhere on the second floor. He and his partner drew their weapons and rushed inside through the back patio. A few agonizingly long minutes passed in silence. Finally, the officers emerged from the back door, pushing a man in handcuffs. He didn't look like a typical burglar. He was half naked, completely disheveled, and clearly high on something heavy. He was slurring profanities and stumbling as the officers dragged him out to the cruiser. He looked completely unstable and dangerous. I got on the phone with my mum again and passed it to one of the officers so they could handle the legal details. When we finally checked the inside of the house, almost every bedroom drawer had been pulled open and rummaged through, though strangely, nothing major seemed to be stolen. It turned out the guy had simply walked in through an unlocked back door while we were playing out front. Having an unhinged stranger break into your house while you're home is something you always assume only happens in movies or on the news. But experiencing it firsthand at 13 years old changed the way I looked at my own home forever.
The next story.
This happened last summer when my older brother, Ben, asked me to stay over at his place for the weekend. He and his fiancée had planned a short getaway months in advance, and all he needed was someone to watch his chocolate lab, Bear. I'd dog-sat Bear plenty of times before, so I agreed without giving it a second thought. Ben lives about 25 minutes outside of town, in a pretty secluded rural area. There are neighbors around, but every house sits on several acres of land, and his entire backyard is surrounded on 3 sides by dense woods. They aren't huge, endless forests, just stretches of trees broken up by dirt trails that local folks use for walking and mountain biking. Bear loved those trails, so Ben told me to take him out once or twice a day like he normally does. I pulled up to the house on Friday afternoon right after they left and settled in. Friday went by without a hitch. Bear was his usual friendly self, and after a nice evening walk, I kicked back, watched some TV, and went to sleep. I had no idea what kind of nightmare was waiting for me the next day. Saturday started out just as quiet. I fed Bear, made breakfast, and took him out on one of the trails around mid-morning. It was warm out, but the thick canopy of trees kept the path cool and shaded. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when Bear suddenly froze dead in his tracks. His ears perked straight up, and he stared intently into the thick brush off to our left. At first, I just stood there waiting for him to move, assuming he'd spotted a squirrel or a deer. I gave his leash a gentle tug, but he barely reacted. He just kept listening. After about 30 seconds, he started walking again, but every few steps he kept turning his head around to look behind us. I actually laughed to myself and told him he was being paranoid, but the further we walked, the more frequently he checked over his shoulder. At one point, he stopped entirely, turned around, and faced the exact direction we had just come from. I looked back down the path too, expecting a hiker or a bicyclist, but there was nothing, just an empty, silent trail. I nudged him forward, finished the loop, and headed back to the house. Once we were inside, Bear went back to acting completely normal. The rest of the afternoon was completely uneventful, but things started getting weird once night fell. I was sitting in Ben's living room watching Game of Thrones. Bear was stretched out on the couch right beside me, fast asleep. It was around 9:30 p.m. and it was pitch black outside. Suddenly, a loud, heavy knock echoed from the front door. It caught me completely off guard. Hearing someone knock that late in such an isolated area instantly made my stomach turn. I muted the TV, walked over to the entryway, and stood by the door without opening it. "Who is it?" I called out. A man's voice answered from the other side, asking, "Hey, is Tom home?" Hearing my own first name sent a chill straight down my spine. I hesitated, then asked, "Tom who?" The guy gave a completely random last name, one that wasn't mine. I swallowed hard and told him he had the wrong house and that nobody by that name lived here. There was a long, heavy pause on the other side of the door. Then the man replied in an eerily calm voice, "I don't think I have the wrong house." That answer made my skin crawl. I told him sternly that he definitely had the wrong place and that I'd appreciate it if he left immediately. I stood there for another 30 seconds waiting for a response, but heard nothing. I carefully cracked open the living room blinds to peek outside. No one was on the porch, and the driveway was empty. It was like he had vanished into thin air. I locked the deadbolt, checked the windows, and tried to brush it off as a creep messing around.
Around 11 p.m., Bear started pacing and whining by the back sliding door. Since he had been asleep for hours, I figured he needed one last bathroom break before bed. I clipped on his leash and stepped out onto the back deck. The floodlights mounted on the house lit up the deck in a small patch of grass, but beyond that, the backyard swallowed all light. The tree line began about 50 yards out, forming a wall of pitch-black darkness. Bear walked down the deck steps into the yard, but before he got far, he froze. His ears went up, exact same way they had on the trail that morning, but this time he wasn't just listening, he started growling. It was a low, guttural sound that quickly grew louder. I squinted toward the dark woods, trying to see what had his attention. For a second, nothing moved. Then I caught it. A dark silhouette of a person ran right across the edge of the tree line and vanished into the woods. It wasn't an animal, it was a person. Before I could even process what I was looking at, Bear exploded forward. The leash ripped right through my hand. He sprinted full speed across the lawn toward the dark trees, barking louder than I'd ever heard him bark. I didn't even think to grab a flashlight. I just took off running after him because there was no way I was losing my brother's dog in those woods.
The moment I crossed the tree line, the darkness swallowed me completely. The dense canopy blocked out whatever moonlight there was. I could hear Bear barking somewhere up ahead, but within seconds I couldn't see a single thing. I slowed my pace, stumbling over roots and branches, yelling Bear's name as loud as I could. Then I heard footsteps. At first, I thought it was Bear running back to me, but the steps sounded heavier, and they weren't in front of me. They were coming from off to my right. I stopped dead in my tracks. The footsteps stopped instantly too. I stood there in the absolute dark, chest heaving. Deep in the woods, Bear barked again, and right then I heard another distinct set of footsteps crackling through the dry leaves, this time directly behind me. My heart shot into my throat. I couldn't see a thing, but I could feel it. I was standing in the dark, unarmed, without a light, and whoever was out there was actively circling around me through the trees. Panic took over completely. I screamed Bear's name one last time, turned around and sprinted blindly back toward the glow of the house. Branches scraped across my face and arms, but I didn't stop until my feet hit the back lawn. I stood by the deck, gasping for air, desperately calling for Bear. Nearly a minute passed before I heard heavy panting and Bear came bursting out of the woods at full speed.
He ran straight up to the deck, turned right back around toward the dark tree line, and stood there growling into the night. I grabbed his collar, dragged him inside, slammed the sliding door shut, and locked every single entrance in that house. I didn't sleep a single wink that night. Bear stayed restless until dawn, occasionally lifting his head and staring at different walls of the house like he was tracking movement outside. Late the next afternoon, Ben and his fiancée finally came home. As soon as they walked in, I sat Ben down and told him everything, from Bear acting paranoid on the trail, to the creep at the door, to the person lurking at the tree line. What chilled me to the bone was Ben's reaction. He went dead silent. He looked at me and admitted that almost the exact same thing had happened to him about a year ago. Bear had acted aggressively toward the woods late at night, and Ben had caught a brief glimpse of someone darting into the tree line before disappearing. He never figured out who it was, and since nothing else happened, he eventually forgot about it. Hearing that made my blood run cold. It meant someone had been stalking that property and watching that house for a very long time. Ben and his fiancée still live there today, and thankfully they haven't had another incident since. But even now, whenever I visit and let Bear out into that backyard after dark, I find myself staring into those woods a little longer than I used to.